California, the reading capital of the world. We're on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. Each week, we read no more than 99 pages of a book, and we live stream a discussion right here with awesome panelists and Q&A. Even if you can't squeeze in the reading, that's okay. You got 99 problems. Reading ain't one. So if you enjoy the conversation, please hit subscribe below. Every vote of support counts. And you can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn at 99 Pages Club. So today is our capstone presentation on Ezra Klein's Why We're Polarized. So, at a part of this book, this has just been an amazing journey for us, especially as we go through election season. We've seen debates, we've seen controversy. We've seen a Supreme Court nomination go through. And, I think we're all walking away with some different takes on how we as a country are divided and what we can actually do to bring ourselves back together. So Klein at the end of his book advocates for really three or four major recommendations. One, first and foremost, he recommends getting rid of the filibuster. He suggests that we actually take more localized focuses in our media consumption and our political engagement. What's actually happening down the road that actually has an impact on my day-to-day life. And then just generally speaking, he's asking us to be mindful of our identities that we inculcate in ourselves and how they may have an effect on our decisions and our preferences. So as always, you can ask questions in the chat or in our anonymous suggestion box at safe.99pagesclub.com. You can submit a question and we'll answer it anonymously. So next, I want to go ahead and introduce our panel, our esteemed panel. First, we got Mr. Michael Lebecki, a smart city technology executive, born in Nigeria, educated in the U.S. at Indiana, Bloomington, and then again at Stanford GSB, currently living in Seoul, South Korea. We're so excited to have him back on the show. Thanks again for coming out, Mike.
Thank you.
All right, next we got Mr. Dan Rendelman. He's a former Apache pilot, originally from Southern Illinois, currently an attorney in Charlottesville, Virginia. Thank you for your service, Dan, and thanks again for being on the show with us, man. We're really excited to have you back. We have Cynthia Abbott, a talent acquisition leader and HR consultant in San Francisco. She's also leading our 99 Pages Hustle Book Club, going live every Thursday. If you're either unemployed or underemployed, looking for that next step, she's got your back. Please join her and her team of HR and talent acquisition supporters that are out there trying to help you land your next gig. And then lastly, but certainly not least, we got Mrs. Sweta Chakraborty, a PhD in behavioral sciences and the North America representative for We Don't Have Time, and a frequent speaker on all sorts of news channels, Newsmax, Fox. You'll see her all over the place, and a very passionate speaker both on global warming, climate change policy, as well as COVID now. So folks, thank you so much for everyone making time for us again. Sweta, I want to start with you because one thing I can't get over is this idea of how we consume media that is sort of tailored to our interests. And I think of pretty much any panelist that we've ever had on the show, you have so much engagement with media day to day. You're constantly sought after for your opinions. Like when you engage in a media conversation in a broadcast, can you tell us a little bit about what their expectations are of you and that political leaning you may hear from them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So literally the first question I get asked by producers, whether I'm going on Newsmax or whether I'm going on MSNBC, is, okay, you're a scientist, but are you a conservative scientist or are you a liberal scientist? And I'm like, is that a question? There needs to be an adjective in front of scientist? I have to pick one or the other? When did science become so politicized? I can't just be a scientist, right? And shameless plug, really, really quick shameless plug. I just did a TED Talk, right? It's available on TED.com. It's called Don't Trust Your Brain. And I explained this in a lot more detail. How, because we are so politicized, that if I have to choose an identity, if a producer demands to know whether I'm a liberal or conservative scientist, I say, can I be a radical centrist? Because I want to be radically committed to the facts. That's it. And if we have to create a political position for that, let's make it centrist. And so unfortunately, that's where increasingly our media is going. And I was just telling, before we went on air, we were just kind of chatting informally a little bit. And I was explaining how I don't get asked to go on some of the more conservative networks because I'm perceived as too liberal. But I'm now, because talking about COVID, and because, again, as a scientist, I look at the facts, I look at the base rate statistics of a real risk as a risk scientist, and I look at community-based transmission, let's say on COVID. My analysis of that has landed me in the favor of some of these more conservative networks that think we're overreacting to COVID. I'm not saying we're overreacting or underreacting, but the way that I presented the information as statistics would suggest that our policies have been used too bluntly, and we perhaps threw everything at this COVID problem without really thinking through and really analyzing the real risk, right? Because I said that, that gets me in the door at Fox, that gets me in the door at Newsmax. And then I'm not gonna lie, I take advantage of that. And then I talk about some of the other issues that I wouldn't be able to reach these audiences with otherwise, because again, we're so polarized. So it's really sad that we can't, I, as a scientist talking about climate change, can't reach some of the audiences I really want to get the science out to. So yeah, we really do choose our media sources. There's so many to choose from. Ezra made it clear in his book how what used to be, 2 broadcasts a day, you didn't have options. You would finish dinner, you'd sit with your family, watch what was available on TV. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted man in America for a long time, regardless of whether you were liberal or conservative. That's changed massively. We need to work that much harder to reach audiences because of their political identities that have become segmented. And on the same side, media needs to reach out despite how they might label me as conservative or liberal. I shouldn't have to be the one jumping through hoops to get to get the science out.
So Swetha, we actually just had a question come in, if you don't mind. And the question is, have you seen the documentary on Hulu? I think we're referring to Totally Under Control. Chelsea Art says, I'd argue we haven't put everything towards COVID, and that early handling would have changed what we needed to do later. Is just out of curiosity, I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot on a documentary you haven't seen, but if the thesis is that we weren't actually putting everything towards it early enough, I mean, does that, to what extent does, I guess to what extent does the scientific community actually bear responsibility for that?
Well, we use the best available evidence at the time. So it's the risk of putting things forward that we know are going to hurt the society versus not doing anything. It's a cost-benefit trade-off. There is thorough analysis that goes in before you put in blunt policy instruments like school closings. We know what the risk of closing schools for children are. That's a known risk versus the unknown risk of having schools open and the impact of COVID, right? So it's known versus unknown. And we need to do careful, thoughtful analysis before you just go and close schools. That's an example. That's one example of something that I think we shouldn't have done. And all of the best science consensus leading up to COVID breaking was do not close schools unless we are confident about the implications of a particular virus. Not knowing the implications of this virus, the fact that we just closed schools, again, as this blunt instrument, I think we will find, again, this is still early, we still haven't been dealing with COVID for a year. I think we will look back and find that more potential harm was done than good. And I know this is controversial. This is why the left-leaning media outlets aren't always happy with me. But I never claim to be liberal either. I am basing it on the consensus of the scientific community, and science versus policy don't always align, right? So we'll have to, we don't know for sure. We'll look back and we'll analyze the numbers in the future. But no, I don't think it's the right decision to take action based on unknown versus known.
Super interesting. Curious if the panel has any reaction to that. I mean, Mike, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, globally, schools were closed.
Yeah.
Right. This wasn't just an American thing. And if you looked at the schools that reopened, they closed back again when they started to see a spike in infection rates. So, yes, we will eventually look back on the data and the statistics and understand the implication. But I would rather err on. I wish our government erred on the side of over caution than under caution, because
I disagree with that.
I'm sorry?
I disagree with that respectfully.
Sure. No problem. Because if you look at let's say countries I live in Korea, and I can tell you that Korea was very strict in relation to how it handled it handled its policies of protective use of equipment in COVID, and also in social distancing very early on. And that's because they have had experience with prior mini pandemics, right? And so they know how to manage it. And if you see the behavior of people here, schools were closed, restaurants were closed, buses and trains were closed. all of that essentially kept people from having to like interact with each other and spread the infection. And then when they started opening gradually, they opened in accordance to the rate of community transmission. And so what we did differently in America is that we completely downplayed it and pretended like this wasn't something that was a big deal. And then we got the results that we had. So I get what you're saying, but I'm saying to you, so that the specific environment that I'm in shows that there was value in taking those drastic actions in the beginning.
Well, but we shouldn't conflate all of these different actions, right? School closures are specific versus social distancing versus wearing masks. I'm not saying there isn't some combination that makes sense. Sweden, I think, handled it right from the get-go. And again, I get so much flack for saying that. But they used the best available consensus that was there from the infectious disease community, from everything we learned from previous epidemics. And rather than using the consensus for policy instruments globally, and it is a global consensus, right? These are shared across borders because epidemics don't respect national borders. So we should have had a consistent global strategy. And the reason we didn't was because ultimately, governance caved to perceptions. It caved to risk perception, people demanding action being taken despite the reality of the risk on the ground.
And then the last point I was going to add on that is, if you open schools, then the government should also put in place the proper environment to reduce transmission or reduce the risk of transmission.
Sure, but look at Germany, right? It's a really good example of schools that have been opened and closed, and they're not finding a correlation between schools opening and the infection rates spiking and decreasing. This is relatively new information coming up, but it's too early for us to analyze. And I want to caution so many.
You can find that correlation in Israel. You can find that correlation. So my thing is this, right? We're getting spurious data from the market, from the environment, and so it's a question of like, which side do you want to like, which policy do you want to like support? Because I can show you data that shows this correlation, and you can show me counter data that shows there's no correlation. So with those two in place, then what do you do?
Right.
So this is actually really interesting. Shweta, if you don't mind me asking you a question here, because what I heard was that like basically a lot of these policies are really responses to political pressure from the public. Did I characterize that correctly?
Yeah.
But I guess it's kind of like a chicken or the egg, right? Because I think part of what Ezra's point here is that if we're all consuming a media diet that sort of speaks to our default worldview, I guess the question is, how does a population educated by a biased media infrastructure actually like make a coherently sound decision? Like what should the expectation be? And I guess the meta question is really like, what does a healthy media diet really look like? Like, what should that expectation be?
Okay, if I heard your question correctly, it's a really good point, is that we ultimately, this is the hypocrisies in how we perceive risk. Okay, so give me like 1 minute to just indulge.
Please. No, we're here for the depth. Let's go.
Okay, so think about when Black Lives Matter, after George Floyd's death, the same people that were shaming Americans for not social distancing were then, the risk tolerance changed very quickly, and then the tolerance to be out and in public in mass protest overtook the fear of COVID-19.
I think that's a wise point. I think I understand you completely.
The fact that our risk perceptions and our risk tolerance changes is extremely transient and changes frequently. And our media and our political identity takes full advantage of that. So these hypocrisies can exist within one person and within one group and community and identity. And we have to be cognizant of that. And despite media outlets manipulating that, that's why it's so important to look at the base rate statistics of risk and look at the numbers and look at the science and look at the consensus that was reached on what to do in these situations before we're actually in the situation. Once we're in it, there's going to be emotion. There's going to be epidemiologists and public health experts who their number one priority is saving lives. It is public health outcomes number one. That's fine. I get it. That's what as a doctor, you are sworn to take an oath to do no harm. But that priority cannot lead when consensus requires all of the ripple effects, the thorough cost-benefit analysis to be taken into account. And that is what was done prior to COVID-19, because knowing that once an outbreak actually comes, the priority will become saving lives at all costs. And also, does that mean we actually save more lives or not? That we don't have the answer to yet. But I think it is very premature to assume that we did more good than harm if you actually look at the ripple effects of what these blunt policy measures were.
Super interesting. Yeah, go ahead, please, of course.
So I have a very different view. And I believe we actually took action too late, and that what we're suffering from is a lack of national policy. We've had a national policy for pretty much every other crisis in our lifetime, except this. And I think part of it, in all honesty, and it goes back to what Klein was saying in his book, we are drowning in crisis and we are drowning in polarization. I mean, how many media strung out crises have we all watched over the past 5, 6, 7 years, right? So I think when this came about, there was kind of this, okay, this is just the next thing in a long line of things, not really understanding what the impact could be. I stand on the side of we should absolutely shut schools down. We should absolutely socially distance. We should mask, and we should find businesses that open too early. Absolutely. Now, my view is probably heavily influenced by the fact that I lost someone very close to me to COVID-19. So within that, I think when we look 20 years from now, we say there's an education gap for children who are not in school. Yes. Are there children who are going hungry because they're not in school to receive the meals that they otherwise would get? Yes. Are there children that don't have access to the internet and the only way they had access to it was at school? Yes. All of those things being held equal, we know this pandemic is deadly. And we know that the really only thing we have is masking and distancing. So we can't open, we can't get back together. We can't think we're all going to go back. We all want to live in the space of normal, but we've never lived September 10th ever again. So why are we chasing this normal, this go back? There is no go back. It'll be the way forward post-COVID with a vaccine. But it's the polarization of our media that I think has exhausted the crisis. Like when this all first came about, I mean, I was traveling and it's like, is this really a big deal? Right? Because remember, H1N1 was going to kill us all and SARS was going to kill us all and the planet's warming and you had the water crisis in Flint and then we had brain-eating amoebas in Texas. And I mean, like, there's been a lot of things that was going to take us out. And it's like, is this really the thing? I do agree with your point, Swetha. And I think we, due to lack of action, we then felt like we needed to take some action, right? And that there could have probably been a happy medium of this is advice, this is safety that could be good for everyone, that didn't have to lead us to where we are now. Because right now we're in a stalemate. You have states that have rising cases, you have states that have dropping cases. No one can really aggregate together because you have pockets.
I mean, I think Shweta is doing a fine job defending herself, so I don't want to jump in. But I do think that one point inherent in what you're saying, Shweta, is also the idea of trust in the advice that you're giving out and whether you're going to damage that in a rush to do something. And I think we actually saw a lot of that early on. People wanted to do something. And we had the Surgeon General of the United States saying, hey, don't wear masks. And why that was the case, where he's saving it for hospitals or what, a lot of people got the message that if you're wearing masks, it's because you are selfish or because you're foolish or one way or the other. And then when they were hearing from the same experts 6 weeks later that everybody needs to wear a mask, their trust in the whole process has eroded quite a bit. Simply because somebody wanted to do something and get some message out there.
Can I just add to that quickly? The mask thing, the reason that was confusing is because the state of consensus on masks it represented that. The World Health Organization, do you remember in the beginning, was like, we are not confident that wearing masks actually has any sort of real positive benefit. And that was because the National Academy's consensus report of infectious disease experts leading up to COVID-19, post swine flu, this report was put together. The consensus was that there was no consensus on it. And that's what we saw reflected with the World Health Organization's advice and what we got in America. And then as more data came out, the science change. And we have to remember that science is not static. It is evolving. We are getting data. We're learning more all the time. And this distrust towards some of these changes that come from scientists shouldn't be seen as we don't know what we're talking about. We don't have our shit together. Rather, it's the point that we are actually constantly trying to improve our understanding of things. So that distrust is also being manipulated through the media in a lot of ways. And it's what's created this science as being part of some political sphere, when really it's actually a very honest representation of where the science is. But nobody looks at those primary sources, right?
So my main issue is that the institutions that used to be the sources of trust have been discredited over the last year. Usually, it should be the CDC that will be front and center, advising us minute by minute, day by day, week by week, on how to adjust our public behavior. But that wasn't the case. Typically, that's what happens in every other administration. So let's not, like, we're talking about this as if it's some kind of theoretical issue. There was like a precedent on how pandemics, there's a playbook for how pandemics should be handled. It wasn't done that way. So, like, let's be clear about that. When we say politicization, we're clear about how it started being politicized. So I agree. So the question now is no longer talking about the past. It's talking about the present and the future. The present and the future is, obviously, we cannot close down, because guess what? It is 1,000 people dying every day. There's like 40,000, 50,000 cases new every day. So, and people are just not going to go back, and you cannot close the economy. So we understand that that's what will happen. But let's not sugarcoat it. It's primarily because we don't have a leader at the very top that put, number one, people first. Because I'm sorry, I am in Asia, and I see how they took specific action that put their citizens first, their citizens' safety first. China's GDP for Q3 rose 6% after declining, while the other countries have declined. Why? Because they took extreme measures, and these are countries that have faced pandemics before. So guess what? If we, America, face another pandemic, maybe we will learn and actually act differently.
You know why America's not doing that? This wasn't scary enough of a disease. It's not like it wasn't Ebola. And nor is this a disease that's considered, this is considered a mild disease by infectious disease standards. I'm on the board of EcoHealth Alliance. It's the infectious disease surveillance mitigation group based out of New York City. It's the one that actually puts field epidemiologists around the world to different hotspots and looks at potential zoonotic disease transfer from bats. Like this one definitely came from bats, but civet cats, pangolins, whatever. Pick your exotic animal that we've not historically engaged with, that now we are just messing with and creating these perfect breeding grounds for viruses to jump from animal to animal, animal to human, begin human to human transmission. It's zoonotic disease transfer. This is a mild disease. We're really terrified of future diseases. Nobody would consider COVID-19 a lethal disease. And because of that, I mean, it's killed people. I'm not saying it hasn't killed people. What I mean is its actual lethality is not even close to where an Ebola is, or something like a bird flu gone really, really incredibly like intense, right?
Swetha, I don't mean to interrupt, but we do have some interesting kind of points to your or questions to your point, if you don't mind, that I think are relevant. So really two. One, Stesha Doku, a physician, says, hey, as a physician, it's hard to hear people say we should have done less from the front lines when it's clear we should have done more sooner. But I think another interesting comment comes from Chelsea. We hear of, she heard of a doctor in Utah today that they're out of beds, discussing triaging ventilators, removing patients that aren't improving. Like, even though it may not be lethal, at the same time, even though it's not as lethal, we still have a limited capacity as a healthcare system. So is it really fair to say that the lethality of a pandemic should be kind of the guiding metric for how we respond versus our capacity? Even if it's not lethal at all, if it's going to completely slam our healthcare system, shouldn't that ratchet up the level of severity of our response as opposed to just how lethal it is?
That's a good question. That's what we got wrong from the beginning. Nobody predicted how many people would die from this. As a mild virus, it killed way more than you would have thought given its lethality. That's what the learning was as this virus progressed. But the reason we didn't go into martial law lockdown, like you just described, Michael, in Asia, is because nobody was bleeding from the eyes going outside and breathing in the air. Until you have that level of fear or risk that comes with like an Ebola type disease or a bubonic plague I saw somebody put in, that we're not going to get that in America. Our culture is not such that you will be able to justify that kind of lockdown that Asia saw. And that worked. That did work. I'm not saying it didn't work, but it wasn't scary enough for America to take that kind of action. Did it end up being incredibly problematic for the United States and 200,000 plus people? Of course, but that wasn't obvious from the beginning.
But if you look at if you listen to Bob Woodward's interview of Trump, and when Trump first heard about how COVID got to the U.S. and what his advisors, the specific recommendation they gave him, and an estimate of people that would be dead, it was 500,000 people that was estimated. And Trump also said it, that if he didn't take action, 2 million people would have been dead. So for me, it isn't so much that it is not clear that the number of people that would die was not specified. But the fact, and I agree with you, Sweta, that yes, we don't have the physical like manifestation of fear on the disease. I get it. But at the same time, scientists knew early on, scientists who were paying attention to this coming out of China, they knew how serious it was. Because a lot of times the people that had the symptoms didn't show signs of it. And that was the biggest fear of it. Right? So for me, like it's yes, the public was not aware of this, but the people in charge, they did know. They had the information, they had the power to actually amplify the fear, right? To get people to straighten up, to act correctly. I remember coming back to the United States in February and wearing a mask, and people looked at me like, who the are you? Like, how contagious are you?
Right.
That was the mentality. While in Korea, if I wasn't wearing a mask, people had the same reaction to me. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like two different responses socially.
Culturally, that's the difference too.
Right. So my thing is, the fact of the matter is, this was an issue of failed leadership. And what I want to talk about next is when we move past COVID, what is the right process, procedure, national standards that needs to be put in place that's independent of the current administration, because it's people's lives that's at risk, not a political party.
Very interesting. I mean, Shweta, this actually gets back to one of the original questions that I posed was, I mean, independent of COVID, like, let's just take a step back. If, you know, Ezra's point is that we need to be more locally focused. Like, what does a healthy media diet look like? As a media personality yourself, and I'd love to just go around the horn and just kind of hear when it comes to how each of you stay balanced and stay engaged without being hyper polarized, still being willing to come on a show like this, express your opinions, and still, you know, go out for the metaphorical beer afterwards. Obviously, we can't do that. But, you know, it's like, this to me is kind of really the ultimate question. And in many ways, as a kind of a secondary layer, is Ezra not part of the problem? Is not Vox Media kind of part of like the systemic, like hyper tailored form of media consumption that he's actually calling out? Sweta, I'd love to hear from you as someone who works so closely with media.
Yeah, great question. I think there's 2 points I want to touch on there. The first one is that he talks about this identity mindfulness. So it's really recognizing, and I also talk about this too. This is what I'm personally working on in my book, which is perception mindfulness. Where is your perception of various risks that emerge, from COVID-19 to Black Lives Matter to police brutality to climate change? Where is your perception coming from? Is it coming from your actual understanding of the risk, or is it coming from your political identity? Is it because you're conservative, you are perceiving less risk of COVID-19 compared to somebody liberal? That mindfulness is really key. We need to do that at an individual level. And he talks about it too as identity mindfulness. And I agree with him there. That's the best way to, as an individual, for those, you know, I always get asked, what do I do? Like, what can I do? Because these concepts are really big and sometimes abstract. Well, really take the time to think about what actually influenced your perception. Recognize that there are subliminal cues in the environment that are completely unrelated, but that are really that are forming your thoughts for you. So don't trust your brain. That's actually the title of my talk. Don't trust your brain. And yeah, because it's true. Because again, our cognitive wiring is from our ancestors. It's from when we would run into a snake and make the fight or flight response to run away. It's not made for this complex, interconnected, global risk environment we find ourselves in. So our brains are working against us a lot of the time. So I think Ezra makes that point too, with identity mindfulness, like realize what identity you're holding as you assess a particular media source or you engage with the media. I do agree that I think, I don't know if Vox is as much part of the problem as like a Fox News is for, for the right, because he made the point in the book, which I thought was really fascinating, that the majority of Republicans get their news from Fox, like 40–50%, versus there's much more of a spectrum if you're a liberal. Not to say that it's still not CNN, but at least it's across CNN, MSNBC, Vox. There's more outlets and there's more diversity, which I'd love to get into too. Why is there so much more diversity among the liberals and Democrats than in the Republican Party? What is uniquely wrong with the Republican Party?
Dan, I'd love for you to take that one, man.
That is a cue for Dan.
Go ahead and inform us on that, Dan. Yeah.
Yeah, what is uniquely wrong with the Republican Party? That is a good question. I was fascinated by his discussion of this as well. He sort of talks about how, there's a point earlier in the book where he's talking about a conversation he's having with President Obama, right? And Obama says something like, there's Fox News for the conservatives, and there's MSNBC for the liberals, and then there's CNN for people who just want to fight. And then there's Vox for you like brainiac nerds or something. It's like, no. From my perspective, there's Fox News for the conservatives, and then for the left, there's everybody else, right? And I think the right sees that not as, hey, what's wrong with the right, but hey, what's wrong with this media environment that everybody else is marching in lockstep? That's a lot of generalization. I don't want to say that everybody's marching in lockstep or that there aren't good faith actors all over the place. But I don't think that you can go from, look, there's all of this liberal dominance in the media elites, or there's all this liberal dominance in academia, to then say, hey, what's wrong with these people whose opinions we aren't hearing and whose opinions we aren't airing, right? If the country is voting, even as it's voting now, I think he makes a big deal about how the Republican Party is dying. It's had a lot of success for a dying party, a party who wins about half of the elections. If you're not hearing their voice as often as you're hearing the other half, I think that might be an indictment on you as opposed to an indictment on half the country.
Yeah, but sorry, go ahead, Cynthia.
Well, I was going to say the Republican Party wins primarily because they gerrymander when they get in positions of power and then rig votes. So then there's not fair distribution of voting when the consensus is to make a decision. Because if you did an up and down poll, most Americans align more Democratic and more centrist. But Republicans have figured out a fantastic way to gerrymander and maintain their power. But I do think there's a valid point you made, though, Dan, and that, why is it there's only, let's say, two main really conservative networks, right? You've got Fox and you've got One American Network, right? OAN is really starting to kind of trend big in this super conservative space. And I actually think it's because Republicans are better at lining up together under the tent. You've got a lot more dispersion amongst Democrats, amongst Democratic Socialists, amongst Libertarians. You've got a lot more views. Whereas Republicans will say, you know what, I want my person to get elected. I may not agree with everything, but I'll line up. So I think that's why you've got mainly two media outlets that really service that need. And while they have been successful, I don't think you can argue that Republicans have primarily been on the wrong side of history since the beginning of history.
Wow, that's incredible. No, I don't feel that way about the party that brought you the Union Army, the party that opposed segregation, the party that didn't like Jim Crow laws, the party that did not support all these segregationists in the South for decade after decade. No, I would not say the Republicans have been on the wrong side of history since the beginning of history.
You don't think voting against the Civil Rights Act of '64?
They didn't. The Republicans voted more for that act than the Democrats did. The higher percentage of Republicans in Congress voted yes for that. He even talks, Ezra Klein talks about that in his book. than Democrats did. The Democrats get the credit because there were more of them in Congress, but no, Republicans supported that bill more than the Democrats did. Absolutely, I won't hand that over.
Goldwater voted against that bill.
Goldwater did vote against that bill. I wish we talked about
and you can't
you
look
can
at your
YouTube why Goldwater voted against. Goldwater voted for every civil rights bill before that for 12 years before the 1964 bill came up. And he did so because he had what it was probably wrong, but a small government federalism objection, a constitutional objection, saying he didn't think that the United States government could do the things that the 1964 civil rights bill did. But he was active and trying to push civil rights bills for years before that. He had one he disagreed with, and now the Democrats take the great credit for it. LBJ, who had pushed down civil rights bill after civil rights bill, finally changes his mind and splits the party, to his great credit. But then we pretend like the Republicans for 100 years weren't pushing for the same thing.
So, okay.
Jim Crow?
For a second.
Not a Republican policy. That's a Democrat policy. The KKK, full of Democrats.
Gerrymandering.
I think it's important to distinguish between conservative, liberal versus Democrat and Republican. Right? We've definitely had party realignment in the spectrum here. So I think that's pretty right. But Michael, why don't you go ahead, man? Jump in.
Well, I was gonna jump in simply because I agree with both of you in the sense that like there's like, you know, one, there's a perception issue with Republicans. But so the Republican of the past, fine, they weren't perfect, but it's fine. But my issue isn't the Republican Party of the past. It's actually now the Trump Party. Like, there's the Trump Party, then there's the old Republican Party, and then there's the Democrats. So then I guess my more important question to you is, what is the future of a Republican Party that is representative of America's values, not just the left side of America, but all of America? So you can argue that Reagan was much more inclusive. You could argue as a Republican than maybe some other Republicans, right? Fine. So I'm saying now, moving forward,
when you win 49 states, it's you look pretty inclusive, yeah.
So when you looking forward, right? What does the Republican Party need to do? Because I'm sorry, like you guys are primarily white male, right male, and you are excluding, at least some of the stance you've taken, excluding a lot of the browning of America. So what does that look like in the future?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I would not grant your assumption the question, right? That there are policies that I've been taking that exclude the browning of America. I certainly wouldn't feel that way. And maybe you probably meant you in a larger sense, and we could talk about which specific.
I don't mean you, Dan, because I know you're not the one making the policies. I mean the broader Republican Party. And let me be specific, because I don't want to like cast aspersions. So specifically, they're who supports adding the citizenship question on census. Republicans. Who supports repealing and replacing Obamacare? Republicans. And fine, I can argue Obamacare is not great, but there's not a better alternative. I can keep going
directly. What's the direct relation here between Obamacare and the browning of America? Is it just that it helps? Could you explain it to me?
Sure. There's a lot of poor people who are black, brown. And when I say black and brown, it's like Latino, blacks, and poor whites who fit that criteria of being covered by the Obamacare. That's what I mean by that.
Okay.
So those are just
a lot of poor white Americans too, of which there are many.
I agree, but if you look at the statistics showing that by 2050, the minority group the majority group is going to be more brown people than white people, purely white people. And if you look at like the demographic of the Republican Party over years, it's declining. Why? Because they don't have enough women in there, relatively. They don't have enough minorities in there. And I don't need to take my word for it. Look at the past votes. Look at the demographics.
But Michael, like at the end of the day, man, like political parties are vehicles to get stuff done, right? I think the real question isn't so much what does the Republican need to change, why the Republicans need to change, because at the end of the day, they have a certain ideology and they're executing on it. Like, like Dan said, they have been able to execute and deliver on pretty much every policy proposal that they need. And I agree, the tent may not be as big. It may not be as inclusive as, as they would like to be. It may not include enough women, may not include enough minorities, may not include a broad swath of the population. Hell, I think like three times in the past 7 elections, when they've won the electoral college, they've lost the popular vote. Absolutely, totally understand. But at the end of the day, if a political party is like an organization with an objective and they're achieving the objectives, the question that I have isn't what does the Republican Party need to do to change? They're doing exactly what they need to do according to their stakeholders. The question in my head is, what does the Democratic Party need to do to change? Why is it that there is such a big tent in the Democratic Party, but they can't get anything done, or they can't really win elections? They can't get the defining cohort necessary to change the way our government works.
That's a great point, because I am looking forward to what's going to happen after this election. If the Democrats win House, Senate, and presidency, guess what? Now the Republicans are going to be like, I cannot believe what these people are doing to our country. Because let's remember these words you guys are using today. Because you say it's a party that's here to get shit done. I'm sorry, forgive my language. I forgot.
That's all good. We're keeping it real. Get shit done. I love it.
Because when Biden goes out FDR style and start creating all this like massive infrastructure projects, pushing for Medicaid for all, pushing for a loan reduction for students, pushing for a lot of issues that Republicans will wilt under. Let's remember these words you guys are just saying. A political party is to get things done. So I cannot wait for the Democratic Party to have the true power to actually get things done.
Well, I actually think that brings up an interesting point, right? Because this has happened in recent history. In 2008, President Obama, who I would argue is a more dynamic, more energetic, more likely to get things done individual than Joe Biden, came into power, and he did so taking the House and taking the Senate. And I remember hearing at the time that the Republican Party is going to be shut out for 40 years, and it's all downhill from there, and they're not going to win any elections. And of course, that wasn't true, right? Like the Democrats' stranglehold on all 3 branches, or not on all 3 elected bodies there, lasted exactly 2 years. And the very next election, they lost the House, right? And then after that, they've lost the Senate. And I sort of continually hear like, oh, this is done. The Republicans are too old. The Republicans are too white. I think these things are dynamic, and they're more dynamic than anybody expects. I read last week in 538 that President Trump is expected to make pretty significant gains with Black and Latino voters over what he had 4 years ago. Now, please don't ask me why that is. I think that there's a lot of possibilities. I'm not going to try and say it's definitely X, Y, or Z. But you look at that, and then you ask yourself, is there any possibility that whoever the Republicans send up 4 years from now replicates that result or makes even greater inroads? And even if it's something like 30% of the Black vote, that would be enough to completely change all the coalitions and all the counties that are important and this race versus that race. It'd be a totally different political landscape. So I think, what's going to have to change? Probably something, and it's probably going to be something about whatever political issue is most important in 2024 or 2028. And I can't predict what those issues are. But I do think the point that Ezra Klein makes is that whatever stance the Republican Party makes on it is going to be based on a faithful reading of the United States Constitution, is going to be based on the idea of limited government, and it's going to be based on the idea of great freedom at an individual level, and that message is one that is still going to apply to whatever policy is important in 2024 and 2028. And it's not one that doesn't have something for minority voters. That's not something that can't speak to the Browning America. I think that's something that immigrants, 3rd, 4th, 5th generation brown Americans can all find something therein and excel in.
Yeah, Cynthia, jump in there. What yeah, I think you had something.
I think that for a long time, and I think one of our viewers commented on this, there was this thought that the reason why Republicans won was primarily just because they voted, right? And that the demographic tends to vote are white, male, and they tend to be Republicans. I also think that what's led to Republicans being in large cohort and in charge has been the lack of access to voting that a lot of minorities and women have experienced. And not just the gerrymandering of districts, but the fact that, you know, your job may not allow you to take off and vote on election day. And now that we've kind of all got this taste of voting by mail and voting early, I don't think you're going to see that go away. I also think you're going to see a lot of, you know, kind of the cross leaking of ideas, if it were. And Swetha, you had mentioned this in a lot of your work as well, that, you know, you're seeing the green initiatives really come into the Republican Party.
Yep.
I think that you're going to see another round, Dan, of essentially flip-flop. And that what was one time considered conservative versus liberal will go through a transition. I also think that the generation behind us will be far more liberal than we all ever thought about being, because they will have a whole new slew of problems to deal with. I think that public health and environmental policy will just be part of their common normal day diet, whereas for us, it was really economics and the fight on terrorism. And if you talk to our parents, it was the fear about financing their houses and, you know, making sure they kept their jobs. Each generation has dealt with whatever was in that, but I don't think that it's going to be this just continuous stronghold. I think it's going to leak into other pieces.
One thing that Ezra said that I thought was really interesting is that, and his view generally since, as he talks about this on his podcast and as he brings on guests to counter some of his points, is that he doesn't want to see actually anything change. He likes that there's this bi-party system where policy is made and repealed and made and repealed. For me, that just seems so counterintuitive. Like, I can't stand it. I can't stand that Roe and Wade come up every 4 years. Like, can we move on from that? We've solved it. Let's move on. Now you know. I'm waiting for Dan to yell.
Yeah, Dan.
We did it.
But what I mean is, like, there's policy. In my head, it's like there should be progress. But he makes the case, and he gives so much historic evidence for why it's actually good that that's not the case. Why things coming up every 4 years maybe is a hallmark of our democracy. But then he had a guest on whose name I forgot, who's written a similar book. You probably know, actually. But his whole thesis at the end of it was, we need succession. Like, we're just too polarized. We don't need to put forward laws and remove laws. Just have the people who want their version of what, you know, the country needs to look like secede and become their own country. And I was like, oh, fascinating, because that's not something Ezra agrees with, despite so much evidence for not really being able to solve this necessarily.
Yeah, weird. Democrats have flip-flopped from trying to secede from the Union to trying to secede from the Union. What a wild 150 years it's been. It's really it's so dynamic.
I have to say though, like, this is why the world looks at America and questions if the democratic capitalistic mixture is actually better or worse than the dictator style economic capitalist environment in China, right? So this is why, like, people are not trying to say, okay, do we want to emulate America or do we want to emulate China? And what I would argue on the point of, like, having to, like, relitigate issues like we have done before is it's almost like we don't build on past successes and we don't learn from the past in some cases, right? Like, some issues come back and we kind of relitigate them and don't move forward. China lays out like 5-year plans that the government must achieve, right? Because its own mandate is economically driven. On economics, I'm not making a case for China here, so you guys don't waste.
I was like, hey man, you're gonna be watching your step there.
5-year plan and communists is a better combination.
And everyone has to work for the government, and no one has the right to choose.
Let me land.
Go ahead, brother.
What I was trying to say is, so for them, they're treating like the country like a company, and they're like moving like gradually in a specific direction. I do think that we should think about our country and say, we should have a general direction, even if it is for 4 years or 8 years that the administration is. Let's try not to necessarily destroy everything, but let's really try to take the best of what we have and keep it. And then if we have to refine something else that needs to fit better for the country, let's do that. But let's keep what works for the general public. For example, if you ask the population said, these are things we care about, we should keep. We should listen to that. And majority means anybody north of 50% is majority.
Michael, how is that not what we do, except that rather than simply operating in a one house parliamentary structure where 51% means complete dominance, we have a divided government with checks and balances, where we divide our power amongst states and federal government, and we divide our power amongst 2 houses of Congress, and we divide our power amongst 3 branches of government. And within those, all of those good faith actors are taking the best of what they see in America and trying to improve it and make it better for the next person. We don't just have a situation where a 51% poll is enough to overwhelm whatever opposition we have. We have a slow, deliberative body, but everybody in there is doing exactly what you're asking them to do. Nobody is in there trying to undermine America or not take what is good and improve upon it. How is that any different?
So let me give like some examples that I would like to talk about. So if you look at the regulations that were put in place after 2008, you can Main Street can argue that those were like the bad actors of 2000, financial bad actors were not significantly punished as Main Street was, right? And yes, the regulations were in place, but then you have like the minority group with strong power are trying to repeal it or put holes in the regulation to essentially make that regulation not really like have any element of teeth to it. And then let's look at like voting rights. Like today, we shouldn't be relitigating voting rights. Yet we are still going back to and fighting around this because there shouldn't be an issue. There should be some issues that we generally say, okay, we've kind of figured this out. Let's move on and go litigate on new issues. There are new issues that are worth litigating. For example, like the whole internet regulation. That would be a conversation like the America should have. What should that look like? Because the tech companies have not been regulated for so long. Now here they are. What should that be? Our attention should be there. We shouldn't be looking back at like voting rights and not be a topic of discussion. Healthcare would be another one we should all sit and talk about and say, let's fix this and move past it. But I can guarantee you it won't be. Tax codes, right? Like there's very, very specific things that just keep coming back over and over again. And fine, I get it. That's how America works. But I'm just wondering, what is the counter to it of what we're losing by not really trying to build on top of that on a consistent level?
But I think, Michael, that's the whole point, though, of the American electorate having the free choice to make those decisions, right? Dan, to the point you made, you have these checks and balances, right? And what's important to the American electorate right now in 2020 will not be important in 24. Just like what's important now in 2020 doesn't seem, one level of important to what we were talking about in 2008. And I think we go back to these fundamentals in truth because they guide a lot of our fabric and our framework and what we do. I think that there's a lot of comparison internationally between like China and Europe and what they do, but fundamentally the freedom of choice and the free movement of people is what guides America. And when Barack Obama won, there was this huge guiding surge that was really in favor of his presidency. And I don't think you can say there wasn't a huge guiding surge that was in favor of Donald Trump winning. I mean, he went out and built the momentum. If you're not building the momentum, whatever you're running for, whether it's the presidency, a Senate seat, a representative, if you're not building the momentum, people aren't going to follow you into that space. And people pick things that maybe are older in subject, but still, pull a response. Voting rights, right? Women's rights. What polarizes us, what will get our eyeballs looking at all of these broadcasts, right? Commenting, following all these people, that's what they pull us towards.
So folks, we are right at 5 minutes for this conversation. First off, this is fantastic. Like I've just been so stimulated by everyone's viewpoints, this conversation, but I want to wrap us up here because I think and take us a little bit out of the weeds and into kind of our more broader takeaways from the book. I'd like to just kind of go around the horn as we wrap up here and just ask your question to, I think Stesha in the chat actually phrased it even better than I could have, which is how do we balance the desires of our identities, and in this case as a proxy for political party, with the need to govern fairly for all those in the jurisdiction? Meaning, when I walk into the voting booth, or when I fill out my ballot, like, to what extent should we all be checking our identities at the door and thinking about the broader values of the United States and how my votes and how my my philosophies will impact someone else? I'm just curious if we can just kind of go around the horn and just from the book. I'm just curious if there's anything. Let's put it this way: is there anything that really changed you, and things that you may do a little differently having read? Dan, I'd love to start with you, man, if that's all right.
Certainly. I think I'll say a couple of things. First, as far as what I might do differently, I think about why I'm personally polarized, like why sometimes am I angry thinking about some political topic. And that's tough, because if I really look at my life and I look at the habits that make me upset, it's when I'm more engaged, I'm more upset. All right. If I read Twitter accounts and read like, oh yeah, the Democrats are doing this, I go away angry. Or even if I read Democratic Twitter accounts and like, oh my goodness, look what this guy's saying, I go away angry. If I get in a Facebook fight about some political thing, it gives me a little bit of turmoil. And I'm sure we've all had that experience where there's like somebody we really like on Facebook, right? Or something. We had a beer with them one time, a really great person, and then they open their mouth about some political topic, and you're just like, I really like you. I wish you weren't saying these things. To some extent, then, like, personally, I think what I need to do is talk less about politics and talk more about, I was going to say sports. That used to be a thing I could say instead of politics. Talk more about, I don't know, the weather and my kid's little league team, which is slightly less contentious than the NFL, and something that draws me out of the political realm. I think as far as your question about when we go into the voting booth, how do we balance our own interests and everybody else's interests? I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. But I think even better is to realize that our system is set up for exactly that question. It is set up exactly for a government governing a nation with a lot of different interests, where different people are represented and want to make their voices heard. And we have lots of different deliberative bodies that balance that out. And so I think what we could do best is support those institutions and their legitimacy and the fundamental democratic processes that they undergo. I think that is where we can have the most voices heard and be civic-minded as well as supporting our own ideas.
Thanks, Dan. Mike, you want to go next?
Sure. I'd like to actually echo on what Dan said, which is on the institutions. I think what makes America great is actually its institutions. And for me, when I am voting, I will vote on candidates that support the integrity of the institutions. Because a lot of times, and I'll give a perfect example. McCain, right? He voted for, he casted like at least one vote that went against the Republican Party, but he kept a broader view of America in place. So for me, I would like to continue to vote according to the institutions of America because, like Dan said, and I believe, in the future of America relies on the strength and viability of those institutions. And as it relates to what I would change personally, to be very frank, I think that it's really difficult to not talk about politics during election periods, right? That's just going to be the case. And if you measure the polarization that happens in America, that happens probably maybe the last 6 months of a presidential election year, generally speaking. So I think that's just part of America. I don't think that's ever really going to ever change, but that's okay. What I would like to not do is essentially like try to hold that animus against those people. Like Darren said, that person, I don't know if you and I are going to be friends anymore after that comment. I would like to just say, look, that's like the hot feeling you have in game time. But once that feeling is gone, okay, you can come back to, okay, you're still a cool person, right? So I would like to just time box it to that period and just say, I will continue to evaluate you as a friend, as an individual, on your behaviors and actions, not necessarily in the political heat at the moment.
Well said. Cynthia?
Yeah. So for me, I've always been a big proponent of voting locally. I think that we can all get bent out of shape about national, and national is super, politicized and it's everywhere. It's in the media, but it's the local vote that's really going to impact your life. When I vote, I always think about, what's the long-term effect on me and those that I know. And one thing that I've done is I've been consuming less media and really been focused on supporting, my female friends and colleagues in their business pursuits, because I find that that gives me the most kind of reward. Because if you think about it long term, there will always be something for the media to tell you and bring you that's hyperbolic forever. Whether it's politics, whether it's religion, whether it's the next thing that's going to kill us, whatever it is, right? The only reason you don't see like aliens on TV all the time is because it's not really, that entrenching. But the media will always be here to entertain and to bring us a message. And we have to come back to, we are people, we make up this country. Let's vote and act like, we can be Americans together and have different ideas.
Right on. Shweta, how about you?
I love it. And Cynthia, you are hashtag women supporting women. That's you. I love it. This is it. It's what you're doing, Rajiv. It's civil discourse. It's these conversations. It's realizing we have more in common than we don't. It's if we took our brains out of our heads and looked at them, the wiring hasn't changed for millennia, and you couldn't tell who was a conservative and who was a liberal from our brains. So let's remember that. Let's remember that we fall prey to our innate biases, and we need to be mindful of what is influencing our interactions with people, our views on different issues and risks and politics, and just be compassionate to people's differences, because we genuinely are going to, our identity is so strong that if you push back with any sort of fact, it doesn't matter how entrenched it is, how robust it is, how scientifically founded it is, if it impacts that tribal identity, then you are going to put up your walls, you're going to have your cognitive dissonance kick off, and you're not going to actually be responsive and engage in any beneficial, productive way. So if everybody just remembers that as they come up against different discourses, topics, types of people, just show compassion. That's my takeaway from this.
Show compassion. I love it. Shweta, I'll stop it right there. I'm going to steal it. Show compassion. That's probably the biggest takeaway I think anyone could walk away with from this book. So folks, thank you so much. Even just as I was watching our viewer counts, like this actually was one of our most highly engaged live streams. I want to thank everyone who watched with us, who read alongside with us. Election day is coming up, regardless of which side of the aisle or what identity you're bringing to the table. Please do vote. Please do check out your local ballots, check out your local mail-in options, and get involved. I just want to thank again Shweta, Dan, Mike, Cynthia. These were some really intense conversations. We all came from different points of view, and I just want to commend every single one of you, because even though it got heated, even though we brought some emotions, we all brought the heat, but we're all friends and we were all friendly, and you kept coming back and treated each other civilly and friendly in a friendly manner. And I just want to thank you guys for setting the example for what right looks like and how we're going to get past some of this polarization. So with that, we're going to sign off. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We're going to be off next weekend, but in 2 weeks, we're back with starting our Veterans Day coverage. Veterans Day takes place I believe the second Tuesday in November. We're going to be reading Tribe by Sebastian Junger. We've got a great set of panelists. We're going to be telling some great stories, and very excited to honor our nation's veterans. And if you're a service member or have served before, thank you for your service. We appreciate it. We'll see you in 2 weeks. All the best.